Rain lashed against the windows of Duke Adrian Blackwood's study with such fury that Eleanor could barely hear her own heart breaking, though perhaps that was a mercy, for its rhythm had become a dirge of shame and desperation that threatened to unmake her entirely. The year was 1847, and London had never seemed so cold, so unforgiving, so utterly indifferent to the ruin of a woman who had once commanded its highest drawing rooms as the Duchess of Wintermere, a title she could no longer claim, not here, not now, not in this moment of her greatest degradation. She stood before the Duke's mahogany desk, her hands clasped so tightly that her gloves strained against her knuckles, and introduced herself with words that tasted of ashes. "Mrs. Eleanor Grey, Your Grace." The lie hung between them like a shroud, and she wondered if he could see through the careful facade she had constructed, if he noticed the quality of her mourning dress despite its age, the aristocratic bearing she could not quite suppress, no matter how she tried to diminish herself. Adrian Blackwood regarded her with eyes the color of a winter storm, cold and remote, assessing her with the detachment one might afford a piece of furniture being considered for purchase, and perhaps that was precisely what she had become, a commodity, a transaction, a fall from grace so complete that the woman who had once opened Parliament balls now negotiated the terms of her own moral surrender. "The arrangement is simple, Mrs. Grey," he said, his voice devoid of warmth, each word precisely articulated as though emotion were a language he had forgotten how to speak. "You will reside in my townhouse, maintain discretion, and be available at my convenience. In return, you will receive an allowance sufficient for your needs." He named a sum that would indeed save her late husband's estate from the creditors who circled it, like carrion birds, enough to preserve what little remained of the Ashford legacy, though it could never restore her honor. Eleanor forced herself to nod, to accept, to sign the document he slid across the desk toward her, and as the pen moved across the paper, she felt herself splitting in two, the Duchess of Wintermere who had once been, and Mrs. Eleanor Grey who must now be. "I understand, Your Grace," she whispered, and the formality of the address was almost laughable given what she had just agreed to become, what desperation had driven her to accept. Adrian's expression remained unchanged, granite hard and utterly impenetrable, and she wondered what manner of man could proposition a woman with such clinical detachment, what sorrows or cruelties had carved away his capacity for warmth until only this cold efficiency remained. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, as though the very heavens wept for what she had done, and Eleanor thought of her late husband Thomas, whose gambling had brought her to this precipice, whose love had been genuine, even if his judgment had been catastrophically flawed. "You will begin tomorrow evening," Adrian said, already turning his attention to other papers on his desk, dismissing her as though she were a matter concluded, a problem solved, nothing more than an arrangement sealed. Eleanor curtsied. Old habits died hard, even in the midst of degradation, and turned toward the door. Each step away from her former life and toward this new, shameful existence, carrying with her the terrible knowledge that she had chosen survival over honor, necessity over dignity, and that the Duchess of Wintermere had ceased to exist the moment Mrs. Eleanor Grey had been born. The following evening arrived with the inevitability of an execution, and Eleanor found herself standing before the townhouse on Grosvenor Square, with a single trunk containing what remained of her dignity and the carefully curated wardrobe of a woman who must appear respectable enough to belong to a duke, yet humble enough not to draw unwanted scrutiny from society's ever-watchful eyes. The house itself rose before her, like a monument to austere elegance, all clean lines and restrained grandeur, its facade revealing nothing of the man within or the shameful arrangement that had brought her to its threshold. And as the door opened to reveal a butler whose face betrayed not the slightest flicker of judgment or curiosity, Eleanor understood that this household had been trained to maintain the same cold detachment that characterized its master. "Mrs. Grey," the butler intoned, and the false name sounded almost obscene in its ordinariness, stripping away centuries of Ashford lineage with two simple syllables. "His Grace has instructed that you be shown to your chambers. I am Winters. Should you require anything, you need only ring." The interior of the house matched its exterior perfectly, beautiful in a severe, controlled manner, with none of the warmth or personal touches that made a house a home, as though Adrian Blackwood had deliberately excised anything that might suggest emotion or vulnerability from his surroundings. Eleanor followed a maid named Mary up the grand staircase, past portraits of Blackwood ancestors who seemed to stare down at her with knowing disapproval, their painted eyes witnessing her shame across the centuries, and she wondered if somewhere in Wintermere House her own portrait still hung, a ghost of the Duchess she had been, before desperation had reduced her to this. The room to which she was shown was larger and more luxurious than she had anticipated, a sitting room adjoining a bedchamber, both decorated in shades of cream and gold, elegant yet impersonal, like a very fine hotel suite, designed for someone who would never truly belong. "His Grace takes his meals in the dining room at 8. Ma'am," Mary offered, her tone carefully neutral, neither warm nor cold, the perfect calibration of a servant who understood the delicate nature of her mistress's position. "He has asked that you join him this evening." The hours until dinner stretched before Eleanor like a sentence yet to be served, and she occupied them by unpacking her meagre possessions and steeling herself for what was to come, trying not to think of the last time she had prepared for an evening meal, when she had been a duchess in her own right and not a purchased companion, when her presence at a table had been a privilege granted rather than an obligation fulfilled. When she finally descended to the dining room, Adrian was already seated, reading correspondence as though she were of no more consequence than the soup course, and when he finally acknowledged her presence with a brief nod, his expression remained as impassive as it had been in his study the previous evening, offering no warmth, no reassurance, nothing to suggest that this arrangement was anything other than what it was, a transaction, cold and commercial, stripped of any pretense of affection or regard. Throughout the meal, their conversation remained painfully formal, confined to topics of such studied neutrality that Eleanor felt as though she were dining with a particularly distant acquaintance, rather than the man who now, by virtue of their arrangement, held claim to her person and her future. And as she retired to her chambers afterward, alone and untouched, she realized with a terrible clarity that this might be worse than if he had simply treated her as the mistress she had agreed to become, this limbo between proprieties. This performance of respectability layered over fundamental indignity, this careful pretense that she was a guest rather than a kept woman, made the reality of her fall all the more devastating, for it forced her to maintain the manners of a duchess while inhabiting the position of a courtesan, to be Eleanor Ashford in bearing while answering to Eleanor Grey in name, to carry the weight of her secrets and her shame with the same impeccable posture she had once used to bear a coronet. Weeks passed with the slow, measured rhythm of a clock counting down to some inevitable reckoning, and Eleanor found herself observing the Duke of Blackwood the way one might study a portrait in a gallery, carefully, minutely, searching for meaning in every brushstroke of his existence, trying to understand the man behind the cold facade that he presented to the world and to her. His routines were rigid, almost militaristic in their precision. He rose at 6, took breakfast alone in his study while reading the Times, spent his mornings attending to estate business with the efficiency that suggested he found comfort in ledgers and contracts, lunched sparely, and devoted his afternoons to correspondence or the rare parliamentary obligation, returning each evening to dine with Eleanor in that same terrible silence that had characterized their first meal together, as though words were a currency he could not afford to spend. She began to notice small things, details that revealed glimpses of the man beneath the armor of his aristocratic reserve, how he always sat in the same chair by the fire, though never seeming to take comfort from its warmth, how he avoided the music room entirely, its door always closed as though it contained something too painful to confront, how he declined every social invitation that arrived, his isolation self-imposed and absolute. The house itself seemed to reflect his internal landscape, beautiful but barren, lacking the personal touches that made a residence feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. And Eleanor realized that Adrian Blackwood had not created a home, but rather a mausoleum, a place to exist without truly living. One evening, she noticed books on his desk, volumes on grief, on loss, their spines worn as though they had been consulted many times, and the titles struck her with unexpected force. On the Nature of Sorrow, Meditations for the Bereaved, works that spoke of a pain so profound that he had sought understanding in the writings of strangers. Their interactions remained painfully formal, brief exchanges that never ventured beyond necessity, yet she sensed something beneath his coldness, a hurt so deep that he had constructed walls not to keep others out, but to keep himself contained, to prevent whatever anguish he carried from spilling forth and consuming him entirely. During their dinners, Eleanor would watch him across the candle-lit table and see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands would occasionally clench as though fighting some internal battle, and the moments when his gaze would drift to the empty chair at the table's head, and his expression would shudder even further, and she understood with growing certainty that she was not the only one haunted by ghosts, not the only one performing a role while hiding a deeper truth. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the afternoon when she thought herself unobserved, she would find him standing at the window of his study, staring out at nothing, his posture suggesting such profound loneliness that her heart ached for him, despite the circumstances that bound them, despite the shameful nature of their arrangement, despite everything that should have made compassion impossible. The servants moved through the house with careful quiet, as though they too understood that their master preferred silence, and from their careful avoidance of certain topics, their gentle handling of particular rooms, Eleanor pieced together a narrative of loss, though its specifics remained maddeningly unclear, only that something had broken in Adrian Blackwood, some fundamental part of him had been damaged beyond repair, and he had chosen to live among the ruins rather than attempt to rebuild. And she wondered what tragedy could transform a man so completely, what sorrow could freeze a heart so thoroughly that even basic human warmth became impossible, and whether anything or anyone could ever thaw the winter that had settled over his soul. Eleanor discovered the library quite by accident on a grey afternoon, when restlessness had driven her to explore the corridors of the townhouse more thoroughly than propriety might have allowed, and when she opened the door to what she had assumed was another unused parlour, she found instead a sanctuary that took her breath away, floor-to-ceiling shelves laden with volumes that spoke of a collector's passion rather than a decorator's attempt at gentility, leather-bound editions arranged with obvious care, works spanning centuries and subjects, from philosophy to poetry, from ancient Greek to contemporary novels, and for the first time since entering this house, Eleanor felt something other than shame and sorrow, felt instead a stirring of genuine pleasure at the prospect of intellectual companionship, even if only with the silent company of books. She began spending her afternoons there, careful to disturb nothing, reading volumes of Wordsworth and Shelley, losing herself in verse that spoke of nature's consolations and beauty's fleeting permanence, and it was in this pursuit that Adrian found her one evening when he returned earlier than usual from his parliamentary obligations, and the expression on his face when he entered the library and saw her curled in the window seat with a volume of Keats held something she had not seen before, surprise, certain, but also a flicker of something that might have been interest or perhaps recognition, as though he had discovered something unexpected in a place he thought he knew completely. "You read poetry," he said, and it was not quite a question, more an observation that carried within it a weight of reassessment, as though this single fact had altered some calculation he had made about her character or worth. Eleanor felt her heart quicken with sudden danger, for she had been so absorbed in the verse that she had forgotten to guard her reactions, forgotten that a woman of the station she pretended to occupy might not be expected to find solace in romantic poetry, or to hold a first edition with the reverent care of one who understood its value, and she chose her words with desperate caution, keeping her voice light and her accent carefully neutral. "I find comfort in beautiful words, Your Grace," she replied, closing the book gently and rising from the window seat, aware that she should perhaps apologize for the presumption of using his library without permission, yet unable to summon the proper contrition when surrounded by such treasures. "I hope I have not overstepped." Adrian moved closer, his gaze falling to the volume in her hands, and something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly, a subtle shift that transformed his austere features into something more human, more accessible. "Keats," he observed, and then, with what might have been the beginning of conversation rather than mere acknowledgement, "Do you have a favorite passage?" The question hung between them like an offered hand, an invitation to connection that Eleanor desperately wanted to grasp, yet knew she must navigate with exquisite care, for her education had been that of a Duchess, comprehensive and classical, and she could discourse on Keats with the fluency of one trained from childhood in literature and the arts. "But Mrs." Eleanor Grey, a woman of uncertain background kept by a duke, should perhaps not possess such refined sensibilities, and so she chose her response carefully, offering insight enough to be truthful, yet restrained enough to maintain her disguise. "I find his understanding of beauty's transience deeply moving," she said quietly, allowing herself this much honesty, "how he captures both the joy of the moment and the sorrow of its passing." For a long moment, Adrian studied her with an intensity that made her pulse race, and she wondered what he saw. Whether her carefully constructed facade had slipped, whether he perceived the aristocrat beneath the pretense, but then he nodded slowly and said, "You may use the library whenever you wish, Mrs. Grey," and the formality of the address stung, even as the permission it granted filled her with gratitude, and as he turned to leave, Eleanor felt the air between them charged with something new, a recognition that perhaps they were both more than they appeared, both hiding depths that their circumstances had forced them to conceal, and she understood with a mixture of hope and terror that something had shifted between them. Some first crack had appeared in the walls they had both constructed, and she did not know whether to welcome this development or fear it, for connection carried with it the risk of revelation, and revelation would destroy everything. Autumn arrived with its characteristic melancholy, painting the city in shades of amber and rust, and as the leaves began their slow descent from the plane trees lining the square outside Adrian's townhouse, Eleanor found herself gathering fragments of understanding about the man who kept her, pieces of a puzzle whispered by servants who had grown comfortable enough with her presence to let certain truths slip in unguarded moments, how the late Duchess had been vibrant and beloved, how her death 3 years prior in childbirth, along with the infant son who had lived only hours, had transformed the Duke from a man known for his warmth and engagement with society into this austere, isolated figure who moved through his own home like a ghost haunting the corridors of his former life, how he had closed the nursery and the music room where his wife had played pianoforte each evening, how he had withdrawn from everything that had once brought him joy, as though happiness itself had become a betrayal of those he had lost. Understanding dawned with the weight of revelation, reshaping everything Eleanor had observed into a narrative of profound grief rather than mere coldness, and she found herself looking at Adrian with new eyes during their silent dinners, seeing not the distant aristocrat who had purchased her companionship, but a man so thoroughly broken by loss that he had armored himself against any possibility of feeling again, and her heart, which she had tried so carefully to guard against any attachment that might complicate her already impossible situation, softened with a compassion that felt dangerous in its intensity. She began leaving small gestures throughout the house, tokens of care that she could offer without presumption or expectation of acknowledgement. A book of Wordsworth's poetry left open on the library table to a passage about nature's capacity to heal, marked with a ribbon of blue silk, his preferred tea prepared exactly as he took it, and waiting in his study when he returned from his morning ride. The fire in the drawing-room lit and ready, though he had never explicitly requested such attention, small acts of tenderness disguised as mere household efficiency, ways of saying what she could not speak aloud, that she saw his pain, that she understood the weight of sorrow he carried, that she wished somehow to ease the burden of his solitary grief. Adrian noticed these gestures. She was certain of it, for she would sometimes catch him pausing over the marked passage in the book, his fingers tracing the words with an expression that suggested he understood the message being offered, or finding him holding the teacup with both hands as though drawing comfort from its warmth, his gaze distant and contemplative, but he said nothing, maintained the formal distance that had characterized their arrangement from the beginning, and Eleanor respected his silence, even as she continued her quiet campaign of care. Understanding that for a man who had lost everything, accepting kindness might require more courage than he yet possessed, the autumn deepened, and with it came a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the house, something indefinable but present nonetheless, as though the air itself had become less heavy, the silences less oppressive, and Eleanor found herself wondering whether healing might be possible even in the most unlikely of circumstances, whether two people bound by an arrangement born of desperation and grief might nevertheless find in each other some measure of solace, some reminder that life continued even after loss, that the heart could survive its breaking and perhaps, given time and tenderness, might even learn to open again. Though she pushed such thoughts away as soon as they formed, reminding herself that she was living a lie, that her deception made any genuine connection impossible, that she was destined to lose whatever fragile understanding they were building, once the truth of her identity inevitably came to light. And yet still she continued her small gestures, unable to stop herself from caring for this wounded man, even as she knew that caring would only deepen the pain that awaited them both. The invitation arrived on heavy cream paper, embossed with the crest of the London Charitable Society, and when Adrian informed Eleanor that evening, over their customary silent dinner, that his attendance at the annual charity ball was unavoidable, given his position on the board, she felt her blood turn cold with a fear that had nothing to do with their arrangement and everything to do with the world she had left behind. The world that still existed just beyond these walls, where she had hidden herself away in shame and desperation. And when he added, with something in his voice that suggested the request cost him some internal struggle, that he would like her to attend as well, though not publicly, that she might observe from one of the private boxes reserved for guests who preferred discretion, she understood both the peculiar honor he was extending and the terrible danger such an evening represented. For the charity ball was the crown jewel of London's social season, attended by every member of the aristocracy, including those who had known her as the Duchess of Wintermere, including Lady Catherine Pemberton, who had been her closest friend before widowhood, and debt had driven Eleanor into hiding, including Lord Hartley, whose sister had married Eleanor's late husband's cousin, and who would certainly recognize her despite any attempt at disguise, and yet she could not refuse without raising Adrian's suspicions, could not explain why a woman of uncertain background would fear attendance at such an event, and so she agreed with a nod and a murmured thank you that concealed the rising panic threatening to choke her. The evening of the ball arrived too quickly, and as Eleanor's maid dressed her in a gown of deep sapphire silk that Adrian had commissioned without consulting her, she studied her reflection with the detached assessment of a woman preparing for battle, noting how the intervening months had changed her, how grief and stress had sharpened her features and added shadows beneath her eyes that even the most skilled application of powder could not entirely conceal, hoping desperately that these changes might be enough to protect her identity, that the former Duchess of Wintermere might remain hidden beneath the facade of Mrs. Eleanor Grey. And when they arrived at the grand ballroom blazing with candlelight and filled with the glittering assembly of London's finest families, Eleanor retreated immediately to the shadowed private box Adrian had arranged, her heart hammering as she recognized face after face, voices carrying up to her refuge with their gossip and laughter, the orchestra playing the same waltzes she had danced to in what felt like another lifetime, and she pressed herself against the wall farthest from the balcony's edge, trying to become invisible while her former world spun and glittered below. And it was then that she saw Lady Catherine holding court near the refreshment tables, saw Lord Hartley approaching Adrian with extended hand and political conversation, saw the dangerous proximity of her two lives threatening to collide, and when Lady Catherine began moving toward the staircase that led to the private boxes, Eleanor felt genuine terror grip her, felt the careful structure of lies she had built threatening to crumble, and she must have made some sound of distress because suddenly Adrian was there, having apparently noticed her absence from the box's edge, and for the first time since their arrangement began, she saw genuine concern in his eyes rather than mere distant politeness, saw him notice her pallor and trembling hands, and he moved closer with a question forming on his lips, just as Lady Catherine's voice echoed from the corridor outside, and Eleanor knew with terrible certainty that everything was about to unravel. The carriage ride back to the townhouse passed in weighted silence, broken only by the rhythm of hooves on cobblestone, and Eleanor could feel Adrian's gaze upon her in the darkness, could sense the questions forming behind his careful assessment of her distress, and when they finally entered his study and he poured them both brandy without asking whether she wished it, she knew the reckoning she had dreaded was beginning, knew that her performance at the ball had revealed too much of what she had worked so desperately to conceal, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of its customary distance, but instead a quality of genuine curiosity edged with something that might have been concern. "You moved through that ballroom as though you belonged there," he said quietly, studying her over the rim of his glass. Not as someone observing a foreign world, but as someone who knew it intimately, who understood its rhythms and hierarchies without conscious thought. And when Lady Catherine passed, you recognized her, did you not? I saw it in your face. the flash of familiarity and fear. Eleanor's hands trembled as she set down her untouched brandy, her mind racing through possible explanations that might satisfy his curiosity without revealing the truth. And she settled on a careful half-truth, one that contained enough honesty to be believable while protecting the core deception upon which her entire position in his house rested. "I was not always as you see me now," she managed, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "Before my circumstances changed, I lived in proximity to such society, observed it closely, understood its patterns, though I was never truly part of it." Adrian leaned forward, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze, knowing that retreat would only deepen his suspicion, and she saw intelligence there along with the grief she had come to recognize, saw a man who was perhaps more perceptive than she had credited, who had noticed not just her distress at the ball, but all the small inconsistencies that had accumulated over their months together. "You speak as they do," he continued, his tone thoughtful rather than accusatory, with the precise diction and educated vocabulary of someone raised among the aristocracy. "You carry yourself with a bearing that suggests years of deportment training. You referenced obscure poetry and classical literature with the ease of someone who received an extensive education. And tonight, when you thought yourself unobserved before the panic took you, I saw you assessing the ballroom with the critical eye of someone who had attended 100 such events." She could feel the walls she had constructed beginning to crumble, and could feel the desperate need to flee, warring with an equally powerful desire to confess everything, to lay down the burden of deception and throw herself upon whatever mercy he might possess. But fear held her tongue, because confession meant losing not just this arrangement that had saved her from debtor's prison, but also these months of unexpected companionship, these evenings of quiet conversation, these small moments of connection with a man who had somehow, despite all her intentions to remain detached, become important to her in ways she had never anticipated. "My education was unusual for someone of my circumstances," she offered carefully. "My father believed in learning regardless of station, invested in tutors he could ill afford, hoped I might improve my position through knowledge and refinement. And this at least was partially true, for her father, the Earl of Ashford, had indeed believed passionately in education, though he had provided it as birthright rather than aspiration." And Adrian listened with an expression that suggested he heard both what she said and what she left unspoken. And when he finally responded, his voice had softened in a way that pierced her defenses more effectively than any accusation. "I think there is far more to your story than you feel able to share," he said quietly, "and I find myself wanting to know it, wanting to understand the woman who has brought small lights into this house of shadows, who leaves poetry marked at passages about healing and prepares tea with thoughtful care, and who looked tonight as though she faced her own past like a spectre she could not escape." And Eleanor felt tears threatening because his kindness was somehow more difficult to bear than suspicion would have been, felt the growing attraction between them like a physical force in the room, dangerous and undeniable, and she knew with terrible certainty that she was falling in love with a man who did not know her true name, who would feel betrayed and deceived when the truth inevitably emerged, and yet she could not seem to stop the momentum of feeling, could not armor her heart against his gradual transformation from cold employer to someone who might, impossibly, be becoming a friend. 3 days passed after their conversation in the study, 3 days in which Adrian seemed to retreat behind his walls of formality, while Eleanor existed in a state of suspended dread, knowing her half-truths had satisfied him only temporarily, knowing that her carefully constructed facade grew more fragile with each passing moment. And then on the 4th evening, as she sat in the drawing-room pretending to read, while her mind spun with anxiety about the future and regret about the past, Adrian entered with something wrapped in cloth beneath his arm, and there was an uncertainty in his bearing that she had never witnessed before, a hesitation that made him seem younger somehow, more vulnerable, and when he spoke her name, Eleanor, not Mrs. Grey but Eleanor, with a softness that made her heart contract, she set aside her book and turned to face him with questions in her eyes. "I have been thinking about our conversation," he began, moving closer but maintaining that careful distance that always existed between them, that space charged with unspoken attraction and impossible circumstance, "about what you said regarding your education, your exposure to literature and refinement, and I realize that in all these months, I have treated this arrangement as merely transactional when you have offered something far more valuable than the terms we agreed upon. You have offered companionship to a man who had forgotten what such connection felt like, small kindnesses that asked nothing in return, and I wish to acknowledge that, with something more personal than the cold courtesy I have shown. He extended the wrapped package toward her, and Eleanor took it with trembling hands, feeling the weight and shape of a book beneath the cloth, and when she carefully unwrapped it, she gasped aloud, because there in her hands lay a first edition of Wordsworth's lyrical ballads, the very collection she had quoted from memory that evening in the library weeks ago when they had first discovered their shared love of poetry. And she knew without asking that this was no common volume, but a rare treasure that must have cost him considerable effort to locate. And the gesture was so tender, so thoughtfully personal, so unlike anything she had expected from their arrangement, that tears sprang to her eyes unbidden, tears she could not control or conceal. "I remembered you quoted from Tintern Abbey," Adrian said quietly, watching her reaction with an intensity that suggested her response mattered deeply to him. The passage about nature and memory, about how certain moments return to us in times of darkness, and I thought perhaps having the words themselves might provide some comfort, might be a light in whatever shadows you carry. And his perception, his recognition that she existed in a state of concealed pain, his desire to offer solace even without knowing the full truth of her circumstances, broke something open inside Eleanor's chest, some last barrier she had maintained against feeling too much, caring too deeply, and the tears spilled over despite her efforts to contain them, running down her cheeks as she clutched the precious volume against her heart. Adrian moved then without apparent thought, closing the distance between them, and for the first time since their arrangement began, he touched her with genuine tenderness rather than the formal courtesies their situation demanded, his hand rising to her face to gently wipe away a tear with his thumb, and the contact sent electricity through Eleanor's entire body, made her breath catch, and her eyes close against the overwhelming mixture of longing and shame and desperate love that threatened to consume her, and when she opened her eyes again, Adrian was looking at her with an expression that revealed everything he felt, the desire and confusion and something deeper that might have been love, beginning to take root, despite all the reasons it should not, could not, must not exist. They stood frozen in that moment of profound connection, his hand still against her cheek, her tears still wet beneath his fingers. The book pressed between them like a talisman of all the words they could not speak, and Eleanor saw fear flash across Adrian's features as he recognized what was happening, recognized that their careful boundaries had dissolved, that whatever existed between them had transcended the cold arrangement that had brought her to his house, and she watched him retreat, watched him step backward with something like panic replacing the tenderness in his eyes, watched him struggle to rebuild the walls that had just crumbled, and she understood because she felt the same terror, the same knowledge that they were sliding towards something that could only end in revelation and ruin, and yet neither of them could seem to stop the momentum of feeling that had been building since that first evening in the library, perhaps even since the rain-soaked night when she had agreed to become his mistress, two lonely souls drawn together by circumstance and held apart by secrets that grew heavier with each passing day. Winter came to London with gentle snow that transformed the grey city into something softer, more forgiving, and as the months passed since that evening, when Adrian had given Eleanor the precious book, and they had both retreated from the precipice of acknowledged feeling, something fundamental had shifted in the careful architecture of their arrangement, had transformed it into something neither of them had names for, but both recognized in the quiet evenings they now spent together in the library, and in the chess games that stretched late into the night, with their easy conversation flowing around strategic moves, in the way Adrian had begun to smile, rare and precious expressions that illuminated his features and made Eleanor's heart ache with tenderness and guilt in equal measure. They had fallen into rhythms of companionship that felt almost like marriage without its name, almost like love without its declaration, and Eleanor found herself existing in a state of bittersweet happiness, shadowed always by the knowledge that this fragile peace rested on foundations of deception, that every moment of genuine connection was also a moment of betrayal, that the man who now looked at her with warmth and something that might be affection did not know her true name, did not know that she was not Mrs. Eleanor Grey but Lady Eleanor Ashford, widowed Duchess of Wintermere, and this secret grew heavier with each passing day, each shared laugh, each evening when they sat before the fire, and he read aloud while she worked at her embroidery, the very picture of domestic tranquility built upon lies. Adrian had changed in ways both subtle and profound, the rigid isolation that had characterized him when she first arrived, giving way to something warmer, more open, and she watched him transform through small moments that accumulated into undeniable evidence of healing, watched him engage with his staff with kindness rather than cold formality, watched him accept invitations to small gatherings he would have previously refused, watched him emerge slowly from the shell of grief that had encased him since his wife's death, and Eleanor knew with painful certainty that she had contributed to this transformation, that her presence had somehow helped him begin to live again, and this knowledge made her deception feel even more monstrous because she had given him companionship while withholding truth, and had offered healing while concealing the very circumstances that made their arrangement necessary. The guilt had become her constant companion, a weight that pressed against her chest in quiet moments, that invaded her dreams and turned her few hours of sleep into restless struggling with conscience, and she began to understand with terrible clarity that this situation could not continue indefinitely, that the love growing between them demanded honesty, even as honesty would destroy everything they had built, and she lived suspended between impossible choices, knowing she should confess but unable to bear the thought of losing him, knowing she should leave before he discovered the truth, but unable to walk away from the only happiness she had known since her husband's death had plunged her into desperation. One evening, as they sat playing chess, the fire casting warm light across Adrian's features as he contemplated his next move, he looked up at her with an expression of such unguarded affection that Eleanor felt her breath catch, felt tears threaten because she knew she did not deserve this tenderness and this growing love from a man who believed her to be someone she was not. And when he reached across the board to touch her hand, a gesture that had become familiar in recent weeks, she had to close her eyes against the pain of loving him while deceiving him, and in that moment she understood with absolute certainty that she could not sustain this double existence much longer, that the reckoning she had been dreading was inevitable, that winter's gentle snow would give way to spring, and with it would come either confession or discovery, either courage or catastrophe, and she could no longer predict which path her cowardice or her conscience would ultimately choose. The letter arrived on a morning when frost painted delicate patterns across the windows, and Eleanor had been sitting in the breakfast room with Adrian, sharing the comfortable silence that had become their morning ritual, when the footman entered with the post, and among the usual correspondence was a cream envelope addressed in a hand Eleanor recognized with sickening immediacy, and she felt the blood drain from her face as she reached for it with trembling fingers, trying to maintain composure even as panic rose in her throat, because she knew what this letter would contain, knew that her creditors had finally tracked her to Adrian's townhouse, and when Adrian asked with concern if she was unwell, noting the sudden pallor of her complexion, she could only shake her head mutely and excuse herself with some fabricated need for privacy, retreating to her chambers, where she broke the seal with shaking hands and read the words that confirmed her worst fears. Mr. Thornbury, the chief creditor handling her late husband's debts, wrote with cold precision that he had discovered her current location through inquiries among London society, that he was aware of her arrangement with the Duke of Blackwood, that unless she produced the outstanding sum of £8,000 within 1 week's time, he would be forced to pursue legal action that would necessarily involve exposing her true identity and circumstances, and the implicit threat was clear as crystal. He would reveal to Adrian and to all of society that his mistress was in fact the Duchess of Wintermere, that she had entered into their agreement under false pretenses, and that she was not the respectable widow of modest means she had claimed to be, but an aristocrat who had fallen so far as to trade her body for financial survival, and this exposure would destroy not only Eleanor, but would bring scandal upon Adrian's house, would make him the subject of society's mockery and speculation. It would attach shame to a man who had already endured so much grief and isolation. Eleanor sat on her bed, clutching the letter, as her mind raced through impossible calculations, knowing she had no way to procure £8,000 in a week's time, knowing that the terms of her arrangement with Adrian provided for her immediate needs, but not for such an extraordinary sum. knowing that she could not possibly ask him for this amount without explaining why she needed it, and thus revealing the very deception that this payment was meant to conceal, and she understood with terrible clarity that she had arrived at the crisis point she had been dreading since the moment she had first presented herself at Adrian's door as Mrs. and Eleanor Grey, that her web of lies had finally become unsustainable, that she faced a choice between confession and flight, and between throwing herself on Adrian's mercy and disappearing before the scandal could touch him. For hours she remained in her chambers, unable to eat or think clearly, alternating between desperate schemes to raise the funds and fatalistic acceptance that her situation was hopeless, and as afternoon faded toward evening, she heard Adrian's footsteps in the corridor, heard his quiet knock and concerned inquiry about whether she was ill, and she called through the door that she merely needed rest, her voice breaking on the lie because she knew she was already beginning her withdrawal from him, already starting the process of severing the connection that had become more precious to her than her own life, and she listened to his footsteps retreat with a grief so profound it felt like dying. That night Eleanor made her decision with a heart that felt already broken beyond repair. She would leave before the week was out, would disappear, without explanation rather than force Adrian to witness her ruin or be touched by its scandal, would spare him the knowledge of her deception and the pain of her betrayal, and though this choice meant losing the only happiness she had known in years, though it meant never seeing his face again, or hearing his voice, or experiencing the gentle warmth of his growing affection, she told herself it was the only honorable course remaining to her, the only way to protect him from the consequences of her desperate choices, and as she began in secret to gather her few possessions and prepare for departure, she wept for what might have been if she had only had the courage to tell him the truth from the beginning, if she had only trusted that his capacity for understanding might extend even to circumstances as dire and shameful as hers. But it was too late now for such regrets, too late for anything, except the cold comfort of knowing that in leaving, she was finally doing something selfless, something that prioritized his welfare over her own longing, and she clung to this thought as winter's darkness gathered outside her window and the countdown to revelation began its inexorable march toward catastrophe. Eleanor had intended to leave at dawn, had packed her modest belongings in the hours before sunrise, with hands that trembled and eyes that burned from sleepless tears, but fate intervened in the form of her own exhausted carelessness. For in her distracted state, she had left upon the writing desk in her chambers the creditor's letter, alongside other correspondence she had been sorting through, in preparation for her departure, documents that bore her true name and title, papers addressed to Her Grace, the Duchess of Wintermere, and when Adrian came seeking her that morning with concern etched upon his features because she had not appeared for breakfast and the servants reported sounds of movement in her rooms at odd hours, he entered to find her chamber in disarray, her trunk half-packed, and upon the desk those damning papers that lay exposed in the pale morning light like evidence at a trial. She heard his sharp intake of breath, turned from where she had been folding a shawl to see him standing frozen with the letter in his hand, his face draining of all color as he read first the creditor's threat and then the other correspondence, his eyes moving over the words, Her Grace, the Duchess of Wintermere, again and again, as though repetition might somehow change their meaning. And Eleanor watched the precise moment when understanding crashed over him like a wave, watched shock give way to something harder and more terrible. Watched the warmth that had gradually illuminated his features over these past months extinguish completely, replaced by an expression of such profound betrayal that she felt her heart shatter even before he spoke. Duchess, he said, and the single word fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples of devastation outward, and there was in his voice such cold fury, such absolute incomprehension that Eleanor could not find words to respond, could only stand mute and trembling as he advanced toward her with the letters clutched in his fist, demanding, Explain this. Explain how you came to my door as Mrs. Eleanor Grey, when you are, in fact, Lady Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Wintermere. Explain how you have shared my home, my table, my—" But he could not finish, could not articulate what else she had shared, and Eleanor found her voice at last, though it emerged broken and desperate, saying, I can explain, Adrian. Please let me explain. But he cut her off with a gesture sharp as a blade, commanding her to speak the truth for once in their acquaintance, to confess the full extent of her deception. The words tumbled from Eleanor then in a torrent of desperate honesty, how her husband had died, leaving debts that exceeded the value of their estate, how the creditors had circled like wolves scenting blood, how she had exhausted every honorable option before arriving at his door, how she had given a false name because she could not bear the additional shame of being known as a duchess, trading her body for financial survival, how every moment with him had been genuine despite the deception of her identity, how she had come to love him though she had no right to such feelings, and as she spoke, she watched his face remain hard and unyielding, watched him process each revelation with visible effort, and when she finally fell silent, spent and shaking, he stood before her like a judge, pronouncing sentence, saying with terrible quiet that she had made him complicit in her fraud, had taken his affection under false pretenses, had transformed what he had believed was an honest arrangement, however unconventional, into an elaborate deception. And did she understand? Could she possibly comprehend what she had done to him, how she had manipulated a man already wounded by loss into caring for a fiction? And Eleanor could only whisper, yes, yes, she understood. Yes, she knew her guilt. Yes, she deserved his anger and his contempt. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was hollow with finality, telling her to leave his house immediately, to take her deceptions and her debts and her false name, and remove herself from his sight. And Eleanor gathered what remained of her dignity, collected her partially packed belongings, and walked past him toward the door, pausing only to say that she was sorry, so desperately sorry, that loving him had been the one true thing in all her lies. But he turned away without response, and she descended the stairs for the last time, knowing she had lost not merely her refuge, but the only man who had ever truly seen her soul, even if he had not known her name. The hired carriage rattled through London's grey streets, carrying Eleanor away from Adrian's townhouse and toward a future that seemed to stretch before her like a barren wasteland. And she sat rigid upon the worn seat, clutching her small trunk with hands that had gone numb from more than just the cold, replaying every moment of their confrontation with a kind of masochistic precision that carved each of his words deeper into her consciousness, and she understood with perfect clarity that his fury was entirely justified, that she had indeed deceived him in the most fundamental way possible, had allowed him to develop feelings for a woman who did not technically exist, for Mrs. Eleanor Grey had been nothing more than a convenient fiction, while Lady Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Wintermere, had hidden behind that mask like a coward, afraid to face the full weight of her own degradation. Yet even as she accepted the righteousness of his anger, even as she acknowledged that she deserved his contempt and his dismissal, a small voice within her whispered that he had not understood, could not possibly comprehend the impossible position she had occupied, the choice between watching her family's ancient estate crumble under the hammer of creditors or sacrificing her honor to preserve what little remained of her late husband's legacy. And this voice grew stronger as the miles passed, transforming her numb acceptance into something sharper, something that tasted of defiance even through her grief. Because had she not warned him from the very beginning that she came to him out of desperation, had she not made clear that her circumstances were dire even if she had concealed their full extent? And could he not see that a woman presenting herself as a widow of modest means, seeking such an arrangement, was by definition already fallen, already ruined? And what difference did a title make to the fundamental transaction they had agreed upon in his study on that rain-soaked evening that now felt like a lifetime ago? The contradiction tore at Eleanor as the carriage approached the coaching inn where she would arrange transport back to Wintermere, the crumbling estate she had fought so desperately to preserve and would now inevitably lose, and she found herself caught between defending her choices and condemning them, between rage at Adrian's inability to see past his own wounded pride to the desperate woman who had loved him with a sincerity that transcended names and titles, and shame at her own capacity for deception, at the ease with which she had maintained her false identity, even as their relationship had deepened into something neither had anticipated or sought. And she wondered whether she had truly believed she could sustain the lie indefinitely, whether some part of her had always known that discovery was inevitable and had simply been too weak or too selfish to sacrifice the happiness she had found in his presence, those stolen months of quiet companionship and growing warmth that had made her feel human again after so long feeling like nothing more than a collection of debts and obligations. When the carriage finally stopped, and the driver opened the door with professional indifference to whatever drama played out in his passenger's red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands, Eleanor descended into the inn's courtyard carrying her trunk and the weight of 2 identities, neither of which seemed to fit anymore, for she was no longer Mrs. Grey, who had known brief happiness in a duke's austere townhouse, and she could never again be the Duchess of Wintermere, who had once moved through society's glittering ballrooms with confidence and grace. And as she arranged for the journey that would carry her back to face her creditors and her ruin, she permitted herself one final thought of Adrian, standing alone in her abandoned chambers, surrounded by the evidence of her deception, and she whispered into the cold air that she was sorry, so desperately sorry, not for the lie itself which had been born of necessity, but for not trusting him enough to offer the truth when trust had begun to grow between them, like something green and new, pushing through winter's frozen ground. And then she turned her face toward home and toward the ending she had perhaps always been destined to meet, believing with the certainty of the condemned that she had lost not merely her refuge but her last chance at redemption and love. The townhouse seemed to expand in Eleanor's absence, its rooms stretching into vast spaces that echoed with silence and accusation, and Adrian moved through them like a ghost haunting his own life, finding her presence in every corner despite her physical departure, in the book left open upon the library table at a passage she had been reading, in the teacup still sitting beside the chair where she had taken her morning tea just days before, in the faint scent of lavender that lingered in the chamber she had occupied, and he found himself standing in that room's doorway more often than he cared to admit, staring at the stripped bed and empty wardrobe, as though they might yield answers to questions he could not fully articulate, even to himself. His anger, which had burned so bright and righteous in the moment of discovery, had begun to cool into something more complicated and infinitely more painful. For in the days since her departure, he had found himself examining not merely her deception, but his own response to it, questioning why the revelation of her true identity had wounded him so deeply when the fundamental nature of their arrangement had always been transactional and impermanent. And he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that somewhere in those months of quiet companionship and growing warmth, he had fallen in love with Mrs. Eleanor Grey, or rather with the woman he had believed her to be, and the discovery that she was, in fact, Lady Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Wintermere, should logically have elevated rather than diminished her in his estimation. Yet it had shattered something in him that he only now recognized as hope. The cruel irony did not escape him, this realization that he had developed profound feelings for a woman he had considered beneath his station, only to discover she had always been his equal, that he had found unexpected joy in what he had believed was a simple arrangement with a desperate widow of modest means, only to learn that the desperation was real, but the circumstances far more complex than he had imagined, and he sat alone in his study night after night, wrestling with the question of what precisely she had deceived him about. For had she not been honest about her widowhood, had she not made clear her desperate circumstances even if she had concealed their full extent, had she not given herself to their arrangement with a sincerity that had gradually transformed it into something neither had anticipated, and was it truly the deception of her name and title that had wounded him, or rather the fact that she had not trusted him enough to offer the truth when trust had begun to grow between them? Adrian found himself remembering moments with painful clarity, the way she had guarded her speech in those early weeks, occasionally allowing educated phrases to slip through before catching herself, the terror in her eyes at the charity ball when she had thought herself recognized, the growing guilt he had observed shadowing her features as their relationship had deepened, and he understood now that she had been caught in an impossible trap of her own making, unable to confess without risking everything, yet unable to continue the deception without betraying the feelings that had developed between them. And he wondered whether he would have possessed the courage to make a different choice in her position, whether pride and honor were virtues one could afford when faced with the complete destruction of everything one had been raised to protect and preserve. The house felt unbearably empty without her presence, without the small sounds of her movement in adjacent rooms, without her quiet voice reading aloud from poetry in the library, without the warmth of companionship that had slowly thawed the frozen landscape of his grief-stricken existence. And Adrian was forced to acknowledge that Eleanor Grey, or Eleanor Ashford, or whatever name she chose to bear, had given him something he had believed lost forever when his wife had died, had reminded him that life could hold gentleness and beauty and connection, and he had repaid her gift with fury and condemnation and exile, and the shame of his own harsh judgment began to weigh upon him more heavily than any deception she had practiced. Wintermere rose before Eleanor like a monument to everything she had failed to preserve, its ancient stones weathered and crumbling in places where funds for repair had long since vanished, its gardens overgrown with weeds that choked the roses her mother had planted decades before, its windows dark and empty, like the eyes of something that had died slowly over many years, and as the hired carriage deposited her at the estate's entrance with her single trunk, containing everything she had left in the world, she felt the full weight of her defeat settle upon her shoulders, like a physical burden that made even breathing require conscious effort. The house was cold, for she had dismissed most of the staff months earlier, when she could no longer pay their wages, keeping only Mrs. Hewitt, the elderly housekeeper who had refused to leave despite Eleanor's inability to compensate her properly, and that loyal woman met her at the door with tears streaming down her weathered face and arms that wrapped around Eleanor with a fierce protectiveness that made something crack in the careful composure she had maintained throughout the journey from London, and she wept then, against Mrs. Hewitt's shoulder, as she had not permitted herself to weep in Adrian's presence, great heaving sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep within her chest, where she had locked away all the accumulated grief and shame and desperate love that had nowhere else to go. The days that followed passed in a kind of numb preparation for the inevitable, for the creditors' letters had grown increasingly threatening, and she knew that within weeks they would arrive to catalogue and claim everything. The furniture that had belonged to her family for generations, the portraits of ancestors who gazed down from the walls with expressions that seemed to judge her failure, the books and silver and crystal that represented not merely material wealth, but the accumulated history of a noble house that would end with her. And she moved through the empty rooms like a ghost, cataloguing memories, touching objects that would soon belong to strangers, saying silent farewells to a life and an identity that were being stripped away piece by piece. Yet it was not the loss of Wintermere that caused her the deepest pain, for she had made her peace with that inevitability long ago when she had first stood in Adrian's study and agreed to become his mistress, trading honor for a temporary reprieve that had always been destined to end in this moment of complete ruin, and instead it was the memory of Adrian himself that haunted her waking hours and invaded her dreams, the way his face had transformed from coldness to genuine warmth over those months together, the sound of his rare laughter when she had made some clever observation during their chess games, the gentleness in his hands when he had touched her face to wipe away her tears, and she understood with perfect clarity that she had lost something infinitely more precious than an estate or a title, had lost the only man who had ever truly seen her, not as a duchess or a burden or an obligation, but simply as Eleanor, a woman worthy of consideration and care and perhaps even love. In the long evenings when darkness fell early, and the house creaked and settled around her like a living thing breathing its last, Eleanor sat at the desk in what had been her father's study and wrote letters she would never send, pouring out her heart in words that flowed with desperate honesty, now that there was no one to read them and no reputation left to protect. And she wrote to Adrian, telling him everything she had not found the courage to say during their confrontation, that she loved him with a depth and sincerity that transcended the deception of her name, that she was sorry not for the lie itself, which had been born of impossible necessity, but for not trusting him with the truth when trust had begun to grow between them, and that she understood his anger and his sense of betrayal and accepted them as her just punishment, and that she would carry the memory of their time together like a treasure even into the poverty and obscurity that awaited her, for he had given her something she had believed forever lost, had reminded her that she was human and capable of feeling and deserving of gentleness. And she sealed these letters and locked them away, knowing they represented the closest she would ever come to redemption or absolution, believing with the certainty of the condemned that reconciliation was impossible, and that the best she could hope for was to face her ruin with whatever dignity remained to a woman who had sacrificed everything and gained nothing but the bittersweet knowledge of what love might have been if circumstances and choices and the weight of necessity had not conspired to destroy it before it could fully bloom. Adrian sat in his study with the documents spread before him, like pieces of a puzzle he had finally assembled into a coherent picture. Having spent 3 days employing investigators to verify every detail of Eleanor's story, and what they had uncovered was not evidence of deliberate manipulation, but rather a chronicle of desperate choices made by a woman who had faced impossible circumstances with the only weapons available to her, for the reports confirmed that her husband, the late Duke of Wintermere, had indeed been a compulsive gambler who had mortgaged every unentailed property and borrowed against the estate's future revenues to fund his addiction, leaving Eleanor widowed at 26 with debts that exceeded £40,000 and creditors who had shown no mercy to a woman who bore no legal responsibility for her husband's excesses, yet found herself morally bound to preserve his family's legacy and protect the tenants and servants who depended upon Wintermere's continued existence. The investigators had discovered that Eleanor had first attempted to settle the debts through legitimate means, selling her jewellery and personal effects, dismissing staff, closing the London house, petitioning distant relatives who had refused her pleas, and even appealing directly to creditors for extended terms or reduced settlements, all of which had been rejected or proven insufficient, and only after exhausting every honourable option had she made the choice to present herself at his door as Mrs. Eleanor Gray, widow of modest means, seeking an arrangement that would provide the funds necessary to satisfy at least the most pressing debts and buy time to find a more permanent solution. Adrian found himself reading and rereading the reports with growing recognition of the courage it must have required to make such a choice, to sacrifice not merely her reputation but her very identity, and to transform herself from Duchess to Mistress and live each day knowing that discovery would mean complete ruin. And he understood now that her deception had not been born of malice or mercenary calculation, but of the same quality he had once valued in his late wife. A fierce determination to protect those under her care, even at tremendous personal cost, and the realization filled him with shame for his harsh condemnation and fury at discovering her true identity, for what he had perceived as betrayal was in fact evidence of precisely the kind of character he most admired, the willingness to bear suffering silently rather than allow it to fall upon those more vulnerable. He thought of the woman he had come to know over those months of quiet companionship, the way she had brought warmth and gentleness into his frozen existence, the sincerity of her responses to his rare moments of openness, the authenticity of her tears when he had given her that book of poetry, and he recognized that nothing about their relationship had been false except the name she had offered and the circumstances she had claimed, for the woman herself had been entirely real, her feelings genuine, her transformation of their transactional arrangement into something deeper, as unexpected to her as it had been to him, and he understood with sudden clarity that in condemning her deception he had committed a far greater sin, had rejected love itself, because it had arrived wrapped in circumstances that offended his pride and challenged his assumptions about station and propriety. The decision, when it crystallized in his mind, came with the force of absolute conviction, for he recognized that he stood at a crossroads where he could choose either to cling to wounded pride and righteous anger, or to pursue the woman who had somehow managed to resurrect his capacity for love, despite all his defenses against it. And the choice was not difficult at all once he acknowledged that Eleanor Ashford, Duchess of Wintermere, was the same woman who had sat across from him during chess games and read poetry aloud in his library and looked at him with eyes that held both hope and fear in equal measure. And if he allowed pride to rob him of the chance to build something real with her, then he was a greater fool than her late husband had been. And so Adrian summoned his solicitor and his banker and set in motion plans that would either salvage everything or demonstrate conclusively that some mistakes, once made, could indeed be corrected if one possessed sufficient determination and resources and the courage to risk one's heart a second time, despite the pain that came from its first breaking. The morning broke grey and heavy over Wintermere, rain threatening in clouds that gathered like witnesses to an execution, and Eleanor stood in the great hall watching through the window as carriages began arriving, each one bearing men in dark coats who carried ledgers and documents that represented the final accounting of everything she had failed to preserve. And she had dressed carefully in her plainest black gown and had arranged her hair simply, had removed even her mother's pearls because soon she would own nothing, and there seemed a cruel irony in wearing jewels to one's own dispossession. And Mrs. Hewitt hovered nearby with tears already streaming down her face, knowing that by day's end the house would be sealed and they would both be turned out into a world that had little mercy for women without means or protection. The creditors assembled in the drawing-room that her grandfather had commissioned, their voices a low murmur of calculation and anticipation, and Eleanor forced herself to enter with her head held high, to greet each man with the courtesy her mother had taught her. Even as they appraised the paintings and furnishings with eyes that saw only monetary value, and the chief creditor, a thin man named Pemberton, whose nose seemed designed for looking down at those he considered beneath him, cleared his throat and began reading from his ledger the catalogue of debts and the proposed schedule of seizure, his voice droning on with numbers that had long since ceased to hold meaning for Eleanor, who understood only that the sum total of her failure was being reduced to pounds and shillings. While the rain began pattering against the windows like tears, the house itself was weeping. She had just resigned herself to signing the documents that would formalize her surrender when the sound of hoofbeats on gravel cut through Pemberton's recitation, rapid and urgent, and every head turned toward the windows as a magnificent black carriage bearing a ducal crest pulled up before the entrance, with a precision that suggested the driver had made this journey with singular purpose, and Eleanor felt her heart lurch painfully in her chest, because she recognized that crest had seen it on correspondence and seals during those months in London. And before she could fully process what Adrian's arrival might mean, the door to the drawing-room opened, and he stood framed in the doorway, his coat damp from rain, his dark eyes sweeping the assembled creditors before settling on Eleanor with an expression that held determination and something else she dared not name for fear of the hope it might ignite. Adrian moved into the room with the commanding presence of a man accustomed to being obeyed, his solicitor and banker following like attendants in a royal procession, and he addressed Pemberton with a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority, stating that he was there on behalf of Her Grace the Duchess of Wintermere to settle all outstanding debts in full immediately, and the effect of his words was electric, creditors straightening in their chairs, Pemberton's thin mouth falling open in shock, Eleanor's own breath catching in her throat as Adrian's banker began producing bank drafts and promissory notes backed by the Duke of Blackwood's personal fortune, sums so staggering that even Pemberton seemed momentarily stunned into silence before his professional instincts reasserted themselves, and he began examining the documents with trembling hands that betrayed his eagerness to conclude a transaction that would see him and his associates paid in full with interest. Eleanor watched as if observing a scene in which she had no part, her mind unable to reconcile the reality of Adrian standing in her ancestral home, settling debts that totaled more than most men would earn in several lifetimes, and she wanted to protest, to refuse this extraordinary gesture, to maintain whatever shreds of pride remained to her, but the words would not come because beneath the shock and confusion there was a question growing larger with each passing moment, a desperate need to understand why he had come, what this meant, whether his presence represented merely the settling of accounts or something infinitely more significant. When the last document had been signed and the creditors dismissed with instructions to submit any additional claims to Adrian's solicitor within the week, when the drawing-room had emptied and they stood alone with rain now falling steadily beyond the windows, Eleanor finally found her voice and asked the question that her heart demanded she know despite her fear of the answer, asked why he had done this, why he had paid debts that were not his responsibility, why he had come at all after she had deceived him so completely, and Adrian crossed the space between them with steps that seemed to measure not merely physical distance, but the emotional chasm that had opened between them during their last painful encounter, and he said words that she would remember for the rest of her life, his voice rough with emotion barely contained, that he had come not as her patron or benefactor, but as a man who had been fool enough to let wounded pride nearly cost him the only woman who had made him feel alive since grief had hollowed him out, that he was there to ask not for her gratitude, but for the chance to court her properly, as equals. As the Duke of Blackwood pursuing the Duchess of Wintermere, and Eleanor felt tears spilling down her face as he continued, his hand reaching up to cup her cheek with the same gentleness he had shown that night. He had given her poetry, asking whether she might find it possible to forgive his harshness and his blindness and his failure to see that the woman he had fallen in love with was precisely the same woman standing before him now, regardless of the name she had and offered or the circumstances that had brought her to his door. And she answered him, not with words, but by stepping into his arms and pressing her face against his chest, where she could hear his heart beating rapid and strong, and she whispered yes against the fabric of his coat, yes to forgiveness, and yes to courtship, and yes to the possibility that love might indeed be strong enough to bridge the distance between what they had been and what they might yet become if they possessed sufficient courage to trust each other with the truth of their hearts. The courtship that began in the drawing-room of Wintermere that rain-soaked afternoon unfolded with a deliberateness that spoke of two people determined to build their foundation properly this time, for Adrian appeared at Eleanor's door 3 days later, bearing flowers from his own hothouse and an invitation to ride through Hyde Park, at the fashionable hour when all of London society would bear witness to the reclusive Duke of Blackwood paying court to the widowed Duchess of Wintermere, and Eleanor accepted with a mixture of trepidation and hope, understanding that he was offering not merely companionship, but public declaration of his intentions, a statement that would invite scrutiny and speculation, but would also establish their relationship as something honorable and equal, rather than the shameful secret it had been. The news spread through drawing rooms and clubs with remarkable speed, whispers transforming into animated conversations about how the Duke, who had shuttered himself away in grief for 3 years, had emerged to pursue a Duchess whose own mourning period had been marked by mysterious seclusion at her country estate, and theories abounded about where they might have met and what had sparked this unexpected romance. But Adrian faced the gossip with the same commanding presence he brought to everything, appearing at Eleanor's side at the opera and the theatre, escorting her to gallery exhibitions and musical evenings, his hand at her elbow, a constant reminder that she no longer faced the world alone. Eleanor found herself navigating the peculiar experience of being courted by a man who already knew her intimately, yet was discovering her anew, for their conversations now ranged freely across topics that had been forbidden territory during those careful months when she had guarded every word for fear of revealing too much, and she spoke openly about her childhood at Wintermere, her disastrous marriage to a man whose charm had masked his destructive habits, her years of trying to manage an estate while creditors circled like ravens, and Adrian listened with an attention that validated rather than judged, his own stories emerging in turn about his beloved first wife, Caroline, who had died of fever, the guilt he carried for failing to save her despite summoning every physician in London, the way grief had calcified around his heart until Eleanor's presence had begun the slow work of thawing what he had believed permanently frozen. They walked through the restored gardens at Wintermere on an afternoon when spring seemed to be considering its arrival, buds tight on branches and the air carrying the first hints of warmth after winter's grip, and Eleanor confessed the shame she still carried about their arrangement, the nights she had lain awake, hating herself for the choice she had made even as she found herself falling in love with him. And Adrian stopped on the path and took both her hands in his and told her that he carried his own shame, for he had treated her as a possession to be acquired rather than a person deserving of respect, had maintained emotional distance as a form of protection that was in truth only cowardice, had judged her harshly for deception when his own behavior had created circumstances that made honesty impossible, and this mutual vulnerability, this willingness to acknowledge their failures and fears, created an intimacy far deeper than physical passion ever could. The weeks passed with a gentleness that felt like healing, chess games in her library where they debated strategy and philosophy, afternoons spent reviewing estate accounts together, as Adrian offered insights gleaned from managing his own properties, evenings at small dinner parties, where they presented themselves as a couple, and Eleanor rediscovered the pleasure of conversation with equals who treated her as Duchess rather than charity case, and through it all ran the growing certainty that what they were building together was not merely romance but partnership, not simply courtship, but the foundation of a life that would honor both their pasts while creating something entirely new. And Eleanor felt herself transforming from the desperate woman who had stood in his study, offering herself for money, into someone who understood that her worth had never been determined by her circumstances, but by her courage in facing them, and she recognized that Adrian had undergone his own transformation, emerging from his fortress of grief to risk his heart again, because love, when it arrived, demanded courage far greater than the comfort of remaining safely numb. Spring arrived at Wintermere with the tentative beauty of a promise being kept, daffodils pushing through earth that had seemed permanently frozen, apple blossoms opening like small declarations of faith, and the gardens that Eleanor's grandfather had designed began revealing themselves again after years of neglect. Each restored bed and pruned hedge, a testament to the possibility of renewal, and it was in this garden on an afternoon when the air carried the scent of lilac and the warmth of genuine hope that Adrian asked Eleanor to walk with him along the paths where she had played as a child, and she sensed something significant in his manner, a nervousness that seemed uncharacteristic of the commanding Duke who faced society's scrutiny with such assurance. And when they reached the rose arbor that her mother had loved, where climbing flowers were just beginning to show their first tight buds, Adrian stopped and turned to face her with an expression that held such tenderness and vulnerability that Eleanor felt her breath catch in anticipation of words she hardly dared hope to hear. He took both her hands in his thumbs brushing across her knuckles with the gentleness that had become his habit, and he began speaking in a voice that trembled slightly with the weight of what he was offering, telling her that he had spent 3 years believing himself incapable of loving again, had constructed walls around his heart that he thought impenetrable, had resigned himself to a half-life of duty and obligation without joy or connection, and then she had arrived in his study that rain-soaked evening, and gradually, without his permission or awareness, he had begun dismantling those walls brick by brick through her courage and her resilience, and the fierce intelligence that shone through regardless of the circumstances that had brought her to him, and he acknowledged his own failures with an honesty that moved Eleanor to tears, confessing that he had been blind to her worth, had judged her by circumstances rather than character, had maintained distance out of cowardice, masquerading as propriety, had nearly lost the most precious gift life had offered him, because he lacked the wisdom to recognize that love was not diminished by unconventional beginnings, but rather proved itself through the willingness to see beyond surfaces to the truth beneath. He spoke of how she had taught him that healing required courage, that opening one's heart again after loss was not betrayal of the past, but honoring of life's possibility, that the woman who had stood before him as Mistress Grey and the Duchess who stood before him now were the same person, and he loved every aspect of her with an intensity that sometimes frightened him because it made him vulnerable again to pain, but also opened him to joy he had thought forever lost. And then he released one of her hands to reach into his coat pocket and withdrew a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the afternoon light and threw back colors of hope and promise, and he knelt before her on the garden path, where spring flowers were beginning their ancient work of transformation, and asked whether she would consent to become his wife, not through obligation or arrangement, but through choice freely made, not as salvation from circumstance, but as partner in building a life together, founded on honesty and trust, and the kind of love that acknowledges imperfection while choosing devotion anyway. And Eleanor looked down at this man, who had travelled such distance from the cold Duke, who had outlined terms in his study to the vulnerable human being, kneeling before her, offering his heart without reservation or protection, and she sank to her knees beside him there on the path, and cupped his face in her hands and said, "Yes," with a voice that carried the full weight of her transformation, from desperate widow to woman who understood her own worth, yes to partnership, and yes to love, and yes to the remarkable truth that sometimes the most broken paths lead to the most beautiful destinations, if one possesses sufficient courage to continue walking them. And as he slipped the ring onto her finger and drew her into his arms, while spring continued its patient work of renewal around them, Eleanor understood that what they had built together through pain and honesty and the willingness to be vulnerable was infinitely more valuable than anything that had come easily, and that the life stretching before them was not merely second chance but authentic beginning, hard-won and therefore precious beyond measure. The wedding took place on a June morning when summer had finally claimed its dominion over England's countryside. The chapel at Wintermere filled with light streaming through stained glass windows that painted the ancient stones in colours of amber and rose and sapphire blue, and Eleanor stood in the small chamber adjoining the chapel, wearing a gown of ivory silk that had been her grandmother's, altered to fit her slender frame, her hands trembling slightly as her lady's maid arranged the veil of Belgian lace that had been a gift from Adrian's sister, who had travelled from Scotland to witness the union of her reclusive brother to the Duchess, whose unconventional courtship had become the talk of every drawing-room in London. And when the moment came to walk down the aisle, Eleanor moved through the assembled guests with her head held high, seeing faces from society who had once known her as the unfortunate Duchess of Wintermere, burdened with a dissolute husband, and now watched with curiosity and speculation as she approached the altar where Adrian waited in formal dress, his expression as she drew near, holding such undisguised love and wonder that Eleanor felt tears threatening to spill, despite her determination to maintain composure, and when she reached him and he took her hand in his, the trembling ceased, because she knew with absolute certainty that this moment was right, that the journey from that rain-soaked evening in his study to this sun-filled chapel had been necessary, that every pain and shame and moment of desperation had been required to strip away pretense and reveal the essential truth of who they were and what they could become together. The ceremony proceeded with the ancient words that had bound countless couples across centuries, but Eleanor heard them as though for the first time, the promises taking on weight and meaning that transcended mere ritual, because they were spoken by two people who understood the cost of commitment, who had seen each other at their worst and most vulnerable and chosen love anyway. And when Adrian slid the gold band onto her finger beside his grandmother's sapphire ring, his voice was steady and certain as he pledged himself to her in sickness and health, in prosperity and adversity, forsaking all others until death should part them. And Eleanor made her own vows with equal conviction, thinking of how far they had both travelled from the cold transactional arrangement that had brought them together to this moment of genuine partnership, freely chosen. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Adrian lifted her veil to kiss her with a tenderness that made several ladies in the congregation reach for their handkerchiefs, Eleanor knew that she was no longer the desperate widow who had sacrificed her dignity for survival, but a woman who had discovered that redemption was possible, that the shame of her choices could be transformed into wisdom, that falling from grace sometimes meant descending far enough to find solid ground upon which to rebuild with honesty as foundation. The wedding breakfast that followed in Wintermere's restored dining room was intimate despite the 40 guests who had gathered to witness the union of the Duke of Blackwood and the Duchess of Wintermere. Society's curiosity evident in the careful observations and polite questions that sought to understand how this romance had developed, and Eleanor navigated the scrutiny with grace born of hard-won self-acceptance, no longer fearing judgment because she understood that her worth was not determined by others' opinions, but by the courage she had shown in facing impossible circumstances and the authenticity with which she had ultimately chosen love and over pretense. And Adrian remained at her side throughout the celebration, his hand finding hers beneath the table during toasts that praised their happiness and speculated delicately about the swift courtship, his eyes meeting hers with shared understanding that they alone knew the full truth of their story, and that truth was theirs, to keep or share as they chose, a privacy that felt like protection rather than secrecy, because it was founded on honesty between them rather than deception of the world. And as evening approached, and guests began departing with wishes for their happiness and thinly veiled curiosity about where they would spend their wedding night, Eleanor stood with her husband in the garden where he had proposed and looked back at Wintermere glowing golden in the sunset light, and understood that she had not merely saved her ancestral home, but had created within it the possibility of genuine happiness, that the estate was no longer a burden to be carried alone, but a foundation upon which to build a shared future. And when Adrian drew her close and asked whether she was content, she answered with absolute truth that she was more than content, she was transformed, and that transformation had required every painful step of the journey, from the woman who had stood in his study, selling herself for money, to the wife who stood in her garden, beloved and cherished, and finally, wonderfully, home. 5 years had passed since that June wedding at Wintermere, and the estate that had once stood as monument to desperation and decay now thrummed with the particular vitality that comes from being truly lived in and loved, the gardens perpetually filled with the laughter of children as 3-year-old Catherine chased her older brother Henry through the rose arbor where their parents had become engaged, while in the nursery the newest addition to the Blackwood family, baby Thomas, slept peacefully under the watchful eye of a doting nurse, and Eleanor stood at the window of the library, watching her children play while her hand rested on her slightly rounded belly that held the secret of a 4th child, not yet announced even to Adrian, and she marveled at how completely her life had transformed from that rain-soaked evening when she had stood in a duke's study and bargained away her dignity for survival, understanding now that what had seemed like her lowest moment had actually been the beginning of a journey toward authenticity and love that she could never have imagined in her desperation. And when Adrian entered the library and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder as they watched their children together, Eleanor leaned back against him and felt the solid certainty of a happiness that had been earned through pain and honesty and the courage to be vulnerable, their unconventional beginning, having become not a source of shame but rather the foundation of a marriage built on acceptance and understanding of each other's flaws and strengths. And she knew that Adrian had been similarly transformed from the cold recluse who had isolated himself in grief to a man who smiled freely and loved deeply, and had learned that opening one's heart required far more courage than protecting it, but offered rewards beyond measure. And as evening approached and they gathered their children for dinner in the dining room where family portraits now included their own likenesses, Eleanor felt profound gratitude for the circuitous path that had led her here, for the desperation that had forced impossible choices, for the shame that had taught her strength, and for the man who had looked beyond circumstances to see her worth and had given her the gift of seeing it herself. Dear listener, perhaps you have heard this story and judged harshly the choices made in moments of desperation. Perhaps you have wondered how a duchess could fall so far, or how an arrangement so transactional could transform into love so true. But consider that we are all of us more than our worst moments, that circumstances sometimes force choices that seem unthinkable until we face them ourselves, and that redemption is always possible for those brave enough to be honest about their failures and open enough to accept love, despite feeling unworthy of it. For Eleanor and Adrian discovered what many never learn, that true intimacy requires the courage to be seen completely, flaws and all, and trusted anyway, that love is not diminished by unconventional beginnings, but rather proves itself through the willingness to build something authentic from broken pieces, and that sometimes we must descend to our lowest point before we can find the solid ground upon which to construct lives of genuine meaning and connection. So look beneath the surfaces of those you encounter. Remember that everyone carries private struggles and makes impossible choices in moments of crisis. Trust in the possibility of second chances and the transformative power of love offered without judgment, and know that the paths that seem most broken often lead to the most beautiful destinations, if we possess sufficient courage to continue walking them with honesty as our compass and vulnerability as our strength. And may you find in your own life the grace to forgive yourself for choices made in desperation, the courage to be authentic, even when pretense seems safer, and the wisdom to recognize that love, when it arrives, is worth every risk required to embrace it fully. May your nights be peaceful, your heart be open, and your journey lead you home to yourself and to those who see you truly and love you anyway. Until we meet again in another story, rest well, and remember that transformation is always possible for those brave enough to begin.